on Wall Street.
Economic indicators.
Who knows where this is going to end up?
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
You have a very strange way with words, Johnny.
I do?
Yeah, you just get yourself into trouble all the time.
Well, there's nothing new there.
But
what are you talking about specifically here?
We're talking about different musical tastes, our musical divergence in the late 80s and early 90s.
I have an eclectic taste.
You have a big round, what do I say?
Arse.
Don't worry. We're listening to a song that North Circular actually will play out with this song.
Okay.
Reminds me of London, early 90s, mooching around.
Yeah, lovely.
Anyway, what's the crack? All good, head?
Yeah, it cracks mighty. I have to say, just before I came down here, I was looking at the news and looking at India. And it's horrifying. It really
the COVID
is.
figures are horrendous there.
But the main hospital in Delhi has essentially collapsed.
They've just too many cases?
Way too many cases. There's queues of people trying to get into the hospital and they're dying on the trolleys outside, trying to get into just to get a bit of oxygen.
Well, I mean, you and I have both been in Delhi, and I mean, even in the best of times, it has that feel that if anything goes wrong here, this city will just collapse. I mean, it has that mental feeling. Well, it's the madness. Old Delhi is the most extraordinary place you can ever go, but it's teeming. I went there last year, just before the pandemic, and you really have a sense of we're 2 or 3 moments away from catastrophe here.
Yeah.
In everything.
Yeah.
And COVID must be a disaster for them.
Absolutely.
They also have an election going on, and Modi continues to electioneer. So there have been these huge rallies.
Why is it that the countries that seem to have very right-wing, nativist kind of leaders, such as Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Trump, when he was there in America, all had the worst figures, the worst performance in dealing with COVID?
Well, because it's the worst attitude, right? And their attitude is that the individual is entirely sovereign and the community is subservient to the individual. So if the individual wants to do something, he or she should be allowed to do it. So something like social distancing is an anathema to them. Now, in fairness to Modi, I think the Indians tried it, but you can't social distance in India. There's too many people. You can't do it.
Yeah.
That's what I was just thinking. Like COVID, imagine in Varanasi, where they are bathing in the Ganges. Thousands, millions of people making pilgrimages all the time, right? Cheek by jowl, they're burning bodies, they're throwing bodies in the river. You can't social distance in a country that has got billions of people. You just can't do it. Chinese managed it, but the Chinese managed it in such a way. I mean, the difference between China and India is amazing, because when you arrive in China, you feel you're in a really modern country. And the infrastructure is amazing, and the train system is amazing, and it's all organized. And I know this sounds crazy, but China doesn't feel overwhelmingly populated, even though it is.
Really?
When you're there, it doesn't.
I've never been.
You don't have the same feeling. It's much better organized. There's a sense that somebody is orchestrating from the top and that the system works. Whereas India is just chaos.
Yeah, it is chaos. I mean, when I was there, there's 1 billion and something people in India, and I think I actually met them all.
No, but we're going to talk about the magic and the beauty of numbers. I know you're going to just glaze over. It's me.
Can't wait. This is going to be a humdinger.
They are fascinating. But it came to me because this week I was reading the FT, and the FT have an amazing journalist, a guy called John Byrne Murdoch, who's putting together all these COVID incredibly brilliant statistics and giving you a sense of what's going on in the world and where countries are vis-a-vis everybody else. But what really always annoyed me about lots of British publications is they never put Ireland in. Ever. The Economist doesn't, the FT doesn't, even though they sell loads of papers here. So you got like Denmark and Luxembourg and Norway and all these countries, not us. So I was on Twitter a little bit saying, Chippy. So I just texted FT, I know we're very small and we're just beside you and we're not that important, but please put us in. And he texted me back, said, absolutely. So now the FT is using Ireland. We're in their data.
Oh, excellent.
Exactly.
Come on,
as a result of yours indignant Dunleary. No, because The thing about data and statistics, John, is it allows you paint pictures. It's a window on the world. And I know that you're kind of glazing over here, but
I'm not really, but go on.
so we're going to talk to Tim Hartford, who's a great UK economist, about data and data purity and how you can use it. But data actually matters. And what we're going to talk about today is why data matters.
Okay, so we're talking about data, Mac.
Yeah.
And the whole story of COVID has been numbers, stats coming out our ears. And, you know, in pretty much every country, there has been the daily update of figures and stuff.
Yes.
And it's like a blizzard of numbers.
Yes, it is. It is. And if you're into numbers like me,
Yeah,
it's fantastic.
But that's when I glaze over. I know you're accusing me of glazing over at numbers. I do. So talk us through the significance of
numbers.
Of numbers and
counting
you know,
and arithmetic and all these things. Well, I've always thought, and I know this might sound weird, certain people will judge a society's sophistication from their culture and their art and their music and their literature and their poetry. So when you talk about the Greeks, for example, you talk about, you know, let's talk about philosophy, let's talk about democracy, let's talk about all these things. All those things are important, but I actually think the most sophisticated societies in the world have historically and now been defined by good data. I know this sounds really weird.
Right.
Good statistics, right?
Yeah.
But statistics are a sign of sophistication. And if you can measure something, and if you're prepared to measure something, what you're actually doing is you're being quite open and transparent about your system, right? And therefore, the most nefarious societies and regimes are the ones that manipulate numbers.
Sure.
And the most open regimes are the ones that give people, like, this is happening, this is where it is, this is where you measure. And what I've always been fascinated with, when I was a kid, you know, looking at numbers, I used to paint pictures in numbers. I used to see all these connections and see how they all related to each other. And I don't know, I just...
Is that those kind of painting by numbers
Yeah,
things?
yeah. But it's
Number one is blue. Number 3 is yellow.
No, but when I started even studying all statistics in university, I was completely alive to them, because you could see stories, you could see where you were relative to other people, you could get to the pitch of the discussion really quickly. You could say, look, here is the evidence, right?
Yeah.
And numbers are evidence. I don't believe, I'm not one of those data people who believes that a blizzard of data is essential to make your mind up about anything. I think you can go on hunches and ideas. And I also sometimes believe that, you know, if you wait for the proof of an idea, you will wait many, many years. Like, all innovations are speculation. Speculation with a gamble is an innovation.
But I suppose the difficult part, you know, when you often get into a row in a pub about something or other, and then out comes...
I never get into a round.
a heated discussion. I do regularly, actually.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of the arguments on either side tend to just be based on anecdotal evidence. And then people make up their mind based on an old story that somebody heard down the road, or I knew a guy once who blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But you need the data and the numbers to actually paint the real picture.
Well, I think that you know, the first thing about it is that there is a reason why anecdotes are better crack, right? Okay, there's a reason why we sing lullabies to children rather than sing algebra to children, because the human mind, if you think about it, the human mind paints pictures. We tell stories. This is what makes us the animal we are.
Yeah.
But the evidential clarity or precision of data is something that just embellishes and brings forward or gives momentum to the best stories. And I think the best storytellers are those who tell the great stories and then say, boom, boom, and give this sort of, and did you know that this is the data behind it? And that's, I think, is a way of telling stories. But the fundamental origin of numbers is fantastic. And why we have various different, what we call base numbers, which is how you put your
what have you been reading?
This is well, I mean, I've been intrigued. Like, for example, you know, the Sumerians, okay, our friends in Mesopotamia, their base was 60. So their entire calculus, right? So like even if you look at the word calculus, it comes from the Roman, the Latin calcul, which is a pebble, because we used pebbles to count. right? So if you go all the way back, you think, okay, where did numbers come from? Why did we start? Why did humans start to count? And the theory is that humans started to count to try and figure out the calendar. So if you imagine, in the world before Netflix, John, if you can think about that, right?
It's a long time ago.
Imagine how much stargazing went on. Think about the world.
Yeah,
If you're sitting,
absolutely.
if you're sitting at the fire, you're in a cave. What do you do every night?
Yeah.
You look at the stars. And I love looking at the stars too,
me
still.
too.
And then what happened was the ancients were looking at the stars and they started to figure out patterns. They thought, what's this? And is there some pattern between the distance between these stars? And is there a relationship between the tides and the moon? And is there a lunar month? And what is that? So stargazing is the basis of all mathematics, right? That we actually sat there.
I would hazard a guess that it was doob. That was the basis of mathematics.
Well, we've been smoking weed for a long, long time. So imagine a primitive John Davis sitting in a cave, skinning up, looking at the stars, waiting for Netflix, but it's not on any device that he has at the time, okay? So he's there in his loincloth and he's looking, he's stargazing, he's saying, hey, Macker, you see that star? That was
See that star, man?
and you see that star, man? That was like over there yesterday, and now it's here. And I'm like, man, no, it's not. I swear to God, right? So think, right? You're the original doob smoking stargazers, right? And they're looking at the stars, and then some dude says, no, I swear, there is a relationship. So they start to measure the distance between stars, right? And they're trying to figure out. So all calculation comes from trying to figure out the calendar. Calendars, of course, based on the lunar calendar, okay? Which they figured out was a 30-day cycle.
Yeah.
And they said, okay, well then we need a number for this, right? We need a number for this. And then they had years and they said, oh, okay, we need another number for this. And suddenly all the numbers begin to emerge based on lunar cycles and calendar cycles, on the tides, on the seasons, on the extraordinary observation that human time was circular until very recently. Now we think of linear time.
Yeah.
We think of, today, tomorrow, and into the future. But for the vast majority of humans' existence, our time was circular. So it was seasonal. So it just went around, day followed night, people died after a certain period of time, cells rejuvenated, flowers died, all that sort of thing.
All the seasons occur every single year.
Yeah, and so for it was totally normal to your concept of time to be circular. And it's only with the discovery of, I actually think, money and interest rates and all those sort of odd things in the future that we put a value on time. In fact, one of the reasons why the Catholic Church was so against interest rates, right? Usury in the Middle Ages is usury was all about putting a value on time. And the Catholic Church said, hold on a second, only God can put a value on time.
Right, okay.
So only God. So that was the philosophical, I get it. But if we come back, so then you think, well, why did we end up with 60 minutes? It's a really bizarre idea. So we have very different bases, right? We have base 10 is what we use all the time.
Yeah.
Right? And that makes a lot of sense because you've 5 digits in one hand and 5 in the other. So it's easy to figure out 10. So we started counting with our fingers. That's why we have base 10.
What about your toes?
Now, interestingly,
Go on.
what is the French expression for 80?
80.
Oh, look at you. Right. Now, where does that come from? Where does that come from? The Frenchman over there is laughing. It comes from 420s. So it means that the tribes, at a certain stage, the tribes that existed in France before the Romans counted with a base 20, and that remained in the French language. That's why they do it, right?
Okay.
So and then you think, okay, but this base 60 is really weird. Right? The base 60 is really weird because that's 60 minutes. So where does that come from?
60 seconds, 60 minutes.
That comes from the Sumerians. They had a base 60 on their basic counting, which was deriving from their observation of linear time or lunar time, but also came from the fact that they had a currency based on barley. And 60 sheaves of barley was one unit of currency.
Okay, right.
So it's all very odd things. But then you think, okay, why is the number 7, like the 7 deadly sins? Why was 7 regarded as such a strange number for the ancients? And it was because you couldn't divide it. So it was an unusual sort of number. And then you think, okay, well, where did all this stuff come from? Where do all these figures and numbers and everything come from? And why did you need to count? And why did you need to quantify everything? Because I think when we start to quantify, we begin to measure. When we begin to measure, we begin to use a part. It's an abstract idea. You use a part of your brain that you're not using in any other way, right? And then when you measure, you become logical. Like I happen to believe that money is the reason that the Greeks invented democracy. That the Greeks came to money. Like, so if you think of the difference between, for example, the great Greek legends written by Homer were written in the 8th and 9th century before the Greeks had money. And those legends were all about, I'm really pissed off. You robbed Helen of Troy. She was my girl. I'm going to go and attack. So it's all about pride and arrogance and ego and vanity and all those male sort of weirdnesses. And then you think, what happened to the Greeks that 200 years later, they'd abandoned all that stuff about pride and victorious macho guys. And they were talking about democracy, and they were talking about philosophy, and they were talking about their obsession with proof and their obsession with quantification. Yeah. And I believe it's coincident with when they started to actually count money, right?
Okay.
And this gave them a logical, calculated way of looking at the world, because suddenly you move from the world of speculation and romance and imagination to the world of counting and linear and logic and things that are provable, right? Which comes back to your point is when you're in the pub, it's the latter day Plato who says, and now I have the proof. Yeah. And he really spoils the party because you can't have loads of points when the argument's over.
I know. That's exactly
it. You know? Right. So we don't like Plato. But then you think, what about data? How is it used and abused? Right? And the abuse of data is something I want to talk now to Tim Hartford about, because he's one of the great sort of UK data guys. He's written lots and lots of books. His latest book called The Data Detective, which is about 10 easy rules to make sense of data. So we'll hold the thought about Plato in the pub.
Indeed.
Because everyone has a Plato in their gang. Yeah. Right?
We have a Mac Plato.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not me. It's somebody totally else. Let's talk to Tim. Mr. Hartford, what's the crack? How are you?
I'm not so bad. How are you, sir?
I'm great. Now let's talk about The Data Detective, because one of the fascinating things about reading you every week in the FT, first of all, I'm always amazed at the amount of stuff you're juggling, which is amazing. Podcasts and the FT column and now this BBC program on vaccinations, but always, what I love about reading your stuff is you make data come alive, right? Which is bloody hard. Tell me, what is your main message in Data Detective?
So this, we should be clear, the title of the book in Ireland and the UK is How to Make the World Add Up. The Data Detective is the US Canada edition. It's the same book. So please don't buy a copy of each and then send me. I mean, please do buy a copy of each, but don't send me complaining emails when you do. So okay. What is the message of the book? The book is trying to help people think more clearly about the world. Now, I believe statistics are an essential tool for seeing loads of stuff about the world that you just can't see with your own eyes, because the world's a big place. And whether you're talking about the national economies or whether you're talking about this virus, you can't see anything. You can't understand anything unless you have solid, robust data at your fingertips. But that said, if the last 5 years present, it's that a lot of what people believe is governed by their emotions, by their political prejudices, by what their friends think. And so I realized I can't just, look at the data and data are important. I had to write a book that helps you think more clearly about data by helping you think more clearly, full stop.
So let's look at this, because, I mean, when you look back like 4 years and we don't like experts, et cetera, what you have is an attack on measuring things at one level. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. Every civilized society has got good statistics. In fact, a sign of an uncivilized society is that they've bad statistics. They've very, very poor ways of measuring. Yeah. And again, it sometimes goes with poverty. It sometimes goes with... So, when you look at societies, if they are measuring exactly, there's a transparency, there's a story that they're telling, as long as you can look and decipher data. But as you'll also know, there's a great expression, which is every statistic has an agenda.
Yeah.
And how do you actually disentangle the agenda from the hard fact?
So I would give 3 pieces of advice, 3 C's. I mean, in the book, there are 10 rules, but we haven't got time to do 10 rules. So let me give you the 3 C's. Number 1 is calm. So the moment you see a statistical claim, or in fact, any claim, a newspaper headline, Facebook post, whatever, just take a moment and notice whether you're having an emotional reaction to it. Does this make me think, yeah, I always knew, or this proves I was right? Does it make you think, oh, those buggers, I can't believe they've done that again? Or whatever it is, are you in denial? Are you jubilant? Are you angry? Are you afraid? Whatever, just notice that and then go back and have another look. Because having noticed your emotional reaction, which is an overwhelming influence on what you then believe and disbelieve, having noticed that, you're in a position to think more clearly. So that's your first C. Second C, context. Get the context for the number. And that means various different things. So the most basic piece of context is what is actually being measured.
Give me an example.
Yeah, a simple example. As the first wave was building, every day we had British politicians appearing on television, I'm sure it was the same in Ireland, and say, this is how many people have died today. But actually, it wasn't how many people had died today. It was how many people had been reported as having died today. And actually, the deaths had taken place 2 days ago, 3 days ago, sometimes a week ago. Which you might think, well, that's just kind of splitting hairs. But no, it's a big deal because we're in the middle of an exponential pandemic and deaths are doubling every week or so, actually every 4 or 5 days. So every time they stood and said, this is how many people died today, was an underestimate, probably by 50%, that all those numbers should have been twice as high. So context means understanding what is actually being measured, but it also means what's the trend? What happened last week? What happened last year? It means comparison. So what can I compare this? So whenever you say, well, how many people died today of COVID? It's just useful to have a sense in your head, well, how many people die every day from any condition? Not trying to exaggerate COVID, not trying to minimize COVID, but just trying to understand it. Now I see what this is like. So that's the second C, get the context, and that, by the way, includes, who is telling me this and why are they telling me this?
Yes, absolutely.
And the third C is curiosity. So curiosity is really behind everything in the book. It's basically saying, I'm not looking at these numbers because I want to win an argument. I'm not looking at these numbers because I'm trying to persuade anybody of anything, including I'm not trying to persuade myself of something. The reason I'm looking at these numbers is because I want to understand the world. The world's an incredibly interesting place. I mean, this is why I'm an economist, why you're an economist, because the economy is a super interesting system. Like it's so human and it's so weird and complicated, and it really matters. And that's true of the world more generally. So be curious. Don't look at these numbers as possible weapons that you can use in order to inflict some political injury on somebody.
Absolutely.
They are windows onto the world. They are there to gaze through and see the rest of the world more clearly. And if you view them like that, in that curious spirit, that's going to help you. So those 3 C's, calm, context, curiosity.
Tim, can I ask you before we go, how could we teach? I'm always intrigued. Of course, I teach at Trinity, and I'm always intrigued in being able to communicate and teach better. So what you've said is, statistics are a window on the world, right? And the world is a fascinating place. And they give you a bird's eye view, which contrasts with your own day-to-day experience. That's the first thing. Secondly, they give you a context, or you should look at them in, why am I looking at this in what context? And third, as you say, all of us react emotionally to something that validates our own opinion or aggressively denigrates our opinion. How would you go about teaching this? Because, for example, this podcast is listened to by a huge amount of students who are studying economics in university. There's obviously studying statistics in university. And I can get the sense from lots of the Patreon discussions we have with them that they're not finding the exciting part. They don't find statistics exciting. How would you tell that story better? Well,
I mean, storytelling is an important part of it. I mean, I love stories. I've got my own podcast, Cautionary Tales, which is basically, I'm going to give you some social science, but the social science is going to come in the form of a story of something going really badly wrong. And we all like a story of something bad happening to somebody else, right? So people listen to the stories. And then halfway through the stories, suddenly I'm into the Dunning-Kruger effect, or I'm into accident theory from safety engineering, or I'm talking about the efficient markets hypothesis, or whatever. There's the social sciences there, but by the time you get there, you want to know how the story ends.
You're vested in a character. You're saying, okay, what happens next? Yeah.
So I love the storytelling, and of course it's not so totally straightforward to be a university teacher and to be constantly telling stories. You've got to cover the material, you've got to cover the technical skills. But hopefully what I do and what you do as well is a complement to that. Another thing I did, and again, it's the stories with economics. Undercover Economist, my first book, is just me wandering around the world going, that's interesting. That the price of that coffee, or the fact that there's a traffic jam there, or that I go into this branch of Sainsbury's and it's charging me something different from this other branch of Sainsbury's, but it's the same company. Why is that? And using those questions as a way to get people involved, get people interested in issues like externalities, price discrimination. And another project I had was 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy, which is a book and a podcast series. And there,
by the way, I've read them all, so you don't have to tell me.
You're very kind.
No, it's true. And by the way, Cautionary Tales, just for anybody listening, Cautionary Tales is an extraordinarily interesting podcast.
Yeah, fiascos, catastrophes, but it's always stories. So with the 50 Things thing, 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy, that's stories about individual technologies, who invented them, and then what the consequences were. And as you talk through the consequences of, say, the diesel engine or the barcode, suddenly you're talking about economics, but it's not with supply curves and it's not with equations. You're talking about a particular place, a particular time, a particular person. And so that's what I try and do. And well, it works for me. Really, I'm just talking about stuff that interests me. And I just hope if it interests me, it'll interest somebody else.
Well, it certainly interests me. I remember we had you a packed house at Kilconomics where you started talking about a gentleman in Germany on a piano that didn't work. If my memory serves me right. And again,
your memory is excellent.
And again, I was there. I wanted to be at that concert. I wanted to be in the concert saying, how the hell is he gonna carry this off? But it's great stuff. Listen, Tim, it's fantastic talking to you. Best of luck with everything.
Thanks so much, David. It's been great chatting.
Great stuff. Cheers, Tim.
Do you know what's interesting? That all of the talk, particularly in the tech world now, is all about data gathering, data manipulation.
They'd annoy you, wouldn't they?
They kind of slice it and dice it in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
It's really interesting what Tim was saying about, it is the window on the world.
It's the story. It's a business. Look, when you think of where it all comes from, like we started with you smoking a big, massive spliff, looking at the stars.
That wasn't me, it was somebody else.
Right, okay. It was a sort of a Sumerian version of John, right? Okay, but again, stargazing. And then you think, well, why do we need to measure so many things? And how did the Egyptians make the pyramids? That always intrigued me. How did they make them stay up?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And how did they make them in such extraordinary precision?
Yeah.
It's because
aliens.
Right. You do read all that Trump shit, don't you?
Go on.
It's because of geometry.
Yes, indeed.
Geometry,
yeah.
isosceles, triangle and all that stuff, because the Egyptians gave geometry to the Greeks.
Yes.
And the Greeks pretended it was their own. But then you go back in history and think, well, why were they obsessed with geometry? And it's a really fascinating story. And this is where, again, all counting stems from the urge to measure stuff. Like the Egyptians were all living in around the Nile Delta, which was the most fertile part of the world.
Yeah.
It's hard for us to understand that the reason that Mark Antony went for Cleopatra, not only she was very beautiful, right? But the Romans wanted to actually, that's because you think she's Liz Taylor. She didn't, it's only the movie, John.
No.
She didn't look like that. Because Egypt was the breadbasket of the world. Now, why is that? It's because the Nile is this amazing river, used to flood every year. And after the floods, this new whole silt and the whole minerals would be deposited on the land, and the land became much, much more fertile. So you could grow extraordinary things in Egypt. Then you think, why was that? Why did the Egyptians become obsessed with counting this sort of stuff? And it's because the monsoons in the Indian Ocean, if you think about where the Nile rises in Ethiopia, the monsoons in the Indian Ocean, which are a kind of a May to September, August event, what they do is the monsoons deposit enormous amounts of water on the Ethiopian mountains.
Yeah.
And it takes time for that to actually percolate down into the river. But the Nile floods every year. And it floods every year on the 15th of August. The Italians call it Ferragosta. And the reason the Italians have this Ferragosta is because the Mediterranean, not only did the Nile flood at the same time, but typically the summer weather broke, all related, of course, in the Mediterranean on the 15th of August. Around then, that was the biggest celebration the Egyptians ever had.
Right.
Now, it's quite interesting. It was originally called the Day of the Tears of Isis, because Isis was the goddess that the Egyptians, and they used to think that she used to cry, which was the flooding of the land.
Yeah.
And then the Egyptians figured out, well, this happens every year at the same time. So why is this? And this is what they used to go back to try and get. But the reason they got into the geometry of it was that once the land flooded, they couldn't figure out who owned what after the flood.
Because all the divisions would have been washed away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they had to figure all this out. And then they could figure out relationships between the various different proportions, right? From there, they had to figure out how to make the pyramids, how these various different relationships could be static and could be actually used in building and architecture. So what I'm saying is, John, numbers, I knew you glazed over earlier on, but we went from Isis, the tears of Isis, to Ferragosta. The whole thing is that numbers are essential to understanding not just mathematics, but understanding humanity. And that's the story of numbers.
Locked out like a dog in the rain, bag on my shoulder and a pocket full of change. To bust his mercy in the early morning light. What did you do on Saturday night? Please take me back to where I used to be, the road we used to share together, you and me. I can't say for right or true or wrong. All I can say is I know where I belong. Post-ice, family of white lines and the Irish Times, the men who drink in A-road pubs and rave flyers, all lost in the same sea. I hear them say it's all yours, maestro, if you'll just give in to me, give in to me. Suicide bridge in the morning watch, the raw fumes and fate wires, and the things that pick up and kick off, from the roar of the spit on the road to Central Reservation, the rapturous players at the petrol station. I love the smell of the fumes coming through the window, but you always rolled the window up. So I have a cigarette and play with a crescendo. I never knew, but I had to give it up. Side of the window, thought I saw your place, you didn't let me in though. These days, they sorry a lot more. Never sure if it's the bailiffs at the door, but I still walk the same road at night, watch the same rain, melt the same lights. Bag on my shoulder and a pocket full of rage. How many late nights does it take you to change? Always thought you were holding me back, but turns out you were just holding me together. Well, I make a move and sound big time, crashing though. I walked for years in the hills of a hero. Suicide bridge in the morning watch, the raw fumes and fate wires, and the things that pick up and kick off, from the roar of the spit on the road to Central Reservation, the rapturous players at the petrol station. Come down over the hill, the lights in the distance glimmering, all shine lit up for me, and a little for you too, or so I thought. Or so I thought. place, on the wrong side of the window. Thought I saw your place, you didn't let me in though. These days, say sorry a lot more. Never sure if it's the bailiffs at the door. But I still walk the same streets at night. Watch the same rain, melt the same lights. Bag on my shoulder and a pocket full of rage. How many late nights does it take me to change?